And we're live.
Hi everyone, welcome to another DMLCommons Salon. It's May 4th and we're here for Unit 3 of the 4-part design-based research strand led by the DML Hub. Today we're discussing making visible the struggles of design-based research. I'm Katie Van Horne from the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm co-facilitating this salon with Daniela, also from CU Boulder, and Sinem from California State San Marcos. I'm excited to welcome our invited panelists who bring a range of backgrounds and expertise from DBR. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. Bill and Eve, want to get started?
I'll start. My name is Eve Mans. I'm an assistant professor at CU Boulder, particularly working in science education.
And I'm Bill Penuel. I'm a professor of educational psychology and learning sciences here at CU Boulder, and work on a variety of research practice partnership engagements, mostly in science education. And I'm also a member of the Connected Learning Research Network, doing a longitudinal study of connected learning.
Shall I go? I'm Susan Giroux, and I'm an associate professor of educational psychology and learning sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. And my research, I have a couple of different research projects, and they're all looking at what I call social design experiments following Chris Gutierrez, and they are about creating transformative learning opportunities for children and community members.
Thank you. One more thing before we get started with our conversation. If you're watching this hangout from the DML Commons webpage, we encourage you to jump onto the Etherpad to talk with others who are watching and also to pose questions. We've broken up the Etherpad into the 3 sections of the conversation, so you can put your questions in there. And you can also join the conversation via Twitter with the hashtag DMLCommons. So, and in the Etherpad, there's a roll call, so we can know who's joining us today. So if you put your name and Twitter handle and anything else about yourself in the Etherpad, that would be great. I'm going to pass it over to Daniela to start the conversation.
Okay. So as hopefully people are writing down their names, and again, thanks for having all of us. I'm Daniella Giacomo, and I'm a PhD student at CU Boulder as well, working on the Connected Learning Research Network on a number of different projects. So we want to start off by talking a little bit to Professor Susan Giroux. And our question, based on her 2008 article, which hopefully all of you have done your homework and read, is, Susan, can you start off by tracing the life of one idea, such as recontextualizing in the particular 2008 piece, over the life of your project and of your writing in that project?
Sure. So I need to acknowledge that this project and the writing that I've done on it has been done collaboratively with Rogers Hall, who is my doctoral advisor at the University of California at Berkeley. And his project that I worked on as a graduate student was called the Math at Work Project. And the heart of that project was looking at the way mathematics was organized, and mathematics practices were organized in workplaces where design was a central feature of the activities, and in classrooms where children were involved in design-based mathematics learning. And so what we were doing was that we were doing comparative ethnographic research in workplace settings and in classrooms, and we were pretty skeptical that the children, well, the kids, they were 8th graders, we were skeptical that they were going to be able to do design-based activities that would really allow them to engage in conceptual practices that were present in the workplaces. And so when we were doing our ethnographic fieldwork in architectural design firms and with population biologists and with cartographers, we were really trying to understand what they were doing, trying to understand the kind of infrastructure, the social and the representational infrastructure that undergirded their work. And we were going into classrooms and trying to see, like, what could we do to make the classroom math practices much more robust and come into contact with the kinds of practices the adult professionals were engaging in their work for their real work practices, like, and purposes. And so And what we were in many classrooms for 2 years. We were in 2 years, we were in how many classrooms? 3 classrooms. And we had teachers doing curriculum units that were organized around design practices that were designed by the Middle School Mathematics Through Applications project at IRL, the now defunct Institute for Research on Learning. And so we were in these classrooms and we were bringing in practices, ideas, and activities that we saw in the workplaces. We were trying to figure out ways to make them come into contact with what kids were doing in the classrooms. So I feel really weird. Can somebody ask me a question or say something? Seem weird? You there? Daniela, you listening to me?
Yes, we're here.
Okay.
I'm taking notes, actually, a little bit of, Susan, on what you're saying in the Etherpad as well.
Cool, thank you. So what we did in the math classrooms was we had the professionals come in and interact with the kids because we realized that that would be a really wonderful way to bring these practices into contact with each other. And in the first year that we had the children working on the architectural design projects, we brought in architects who came in to look at the kids' architectural designs. And in those interactions that we watched in the first semester of our project, we saw some really cool things happening. We saw the kids get really interested in the architectural design practices, and we saw the architects really talking about and using their tools and practices like trace paper. Like they'd throw it up on the wall over kids' designs and start talking about it like they were architects. And that was like a kind of conversation we'd never heard in the classroom before we brought the architects in, even though we tried to seed it in lots of other ways. We, as researchers, tried to bring in our ethnographic insights and bring in video clips of architects at work, and none of that clicked with the kids. It really clicked with kids when they saw the architects working with the children's created designs. And so based on that insight that we gained from doing the ethnography, the next time we did the curriculum unit, we intentionally designed for these kinds of exchanges to happen. And in that intentional design process, that's when we recognized that there were some really interesting conversations that were happening between design professionals and kids, and some that were less interesting. And I want to mark that we wrote about this early on, like I wrote about it in my dissertation when we were doing this work, and then many years later, we went back and kind of followed up on that idea because we knew something was happening, but it wasn't a focus of our research. We had designed for these things to happen, but we didn't study it. Then we really studied it in detail, and that's the paper that we wrote. That is like from 2008, is that right? In 2008, we did a very systematic analysis of what was going on in the conversations that was interesting, and that was what we called recontextualizing. Yes?
Mm-hmm. That was great, Susan. Thank you. And for those of you listening, there's the notes going on as well.
Can I follow up with Susan on
please?
That interested me? Because I think I've had a similar experience when you're really deeply embedded in the classroom and you're beginning to see these kinds of practices emerging. So, like, how would you say when you were looking at recontextualization in the classroom, like, can you compare how you were able to recognize it when it was going on around you in the classroom from when you later wrote about it and analyzed it? And what would you say the similarities and differences were in your understanding of it then as a result of the analysis?
Yeah, so what changed when we wrote about, what I wrote about when we first saw it take off in the classroom was there was a complete change in the energy of the discussion. I mean, kids were, at first, when kids had these adult professionals come in, the children, they weren't children, they're 8th graders. 8th graders would respond to these questions as if they were in a typical classroom. They would shut it down when the visitors tried to push them to consider new possibilities for their designs. They would act like, what are you talking about? We're done. This is our poster. That's our final project. But when we had some persistent adult professionals asking questions, they didn't let the kids off the hook, and they kept trying to get the kids to talk about their designs and imagine what their design could look like if they, and they throw a piece of trace paper on top of a kid's architectural plan and draw another version over the kids' designs. And the kids were, like you saw, them suddenly become interested in what the architects were doing. And then the next time when they started talking, they would talk as if they were more interested in their designs and talk like what we thought were architects. And so we noticed that the next time we did it, we organized it and we talked to the professionals we brought in, and we told them that the kinds of questions that really spark the kids' imagination are these kinds that ask them, imagine what would happen if you change this one thing in your design. And the kids couldn't have the option of saying, well, I can't do it because I don't have the software in front of me, because in the first time we did it, they didn't have their software in front of them. This time we knew they couldn't use that excuse. We put the software they used to create their designs right next to them, and they had no choice. So the biologists would say to them, what would happen if you change this in your model? And then the kids would say, I don't know, like I didn't do that. And the biologist would say, why don't you jump on the software and try it out? Why don't you put in this number? And so that was the kind of thing that was happening when we noticed, oh, this is kind of cool. These people are asking them to do work that they would do themselves if they were in a lab. And then the analysis later was completely different. I mean, it was really surprising to look through many of these design reviews that these young people were doing with these biologists. And we thought there were some kids who had great conversations, and when we analyzed it in great detail, they weren't always conceptually as interesting as what we thought was happening. And so that, that kind of close analysis helped us understand which conversations led to different kinds of outcomes. So some of those outcomes were new conceptual understandings and sort of expanding what they understood about the discipline, and others were just like deepening their understanding of what they had already done. And so we couldn't figure that out based on what we had done just from living the design, but we knew there was a different kind of energy and that the kids were positioning themselves differently when we were doing it in like real time. Let's see.
So that's very helpful, Susan, and that sort of leads into another question I have, which is towards the end of the paper, the last section of the paper, you and the colleagues that you wrote with do propose some sort of like larger principles or tenets.
Yep.
Can you talk us a little bit through that in terms of how you felt like what you had done up until that point merited those sorts of design principles, and if you would do something differently now? Just curious about that process.
Well, so like I want to mark that we were in a lot of classrooms, and we were in 3 classrooms, but we did 2 curriculum units in each of those classrooms. So that's a lot of times where we had the opportunity to organize these design reviews. So we had a lot of data, right? And we had multiple groups in each classroom. So if you had like 10 groups in each class, and we had, however many I just said, we had like 6 different units, that was a lot of data. So we reviewed all of those materials in different forms. I mean, there were dissertations, there were articles written about it, and then there was this like deep analysis of what we did. And in addition, our field notes. So we felt pretty justified with the 3, I feel like they're very high-level principles about what we think leads to good recontextualizing exchanges. We tried to keep them very low to the, close to our data, but they weren't so specific that I feel like they were high level enough and grounded at the same time. So one of the things we said was that it's important that the kids are doing real authentic projects, and they're using the real tools and representational practices of the communities that are the target communities. That's fundamental to what we did. Did you have a different question about that, or are you wondering about the level of abstraction about the principles?
No, that was helpful, and I'm actually wondering if even Bill want to speak to sort of that the latter part of the article as well.
I can jump in and connect to that in the sense that I think one of the things that is a struggle in all design research is to think about the right level at which you pitch your conjectures. And often at the beginning, we begin with some pretty high-level conjectures too, and then have to embody them in particular designs. And one of the tools that Eve and I talked about that comes from Bill Sandoval's work of a conjecture map, I found really useful in more recent work precisely because it helps me to thread my initial ideas into some more specific designs, embodiments, and to really be disciplined about that, because I don't think I always have been in my design research. I go by feel, I go by intuition, I go by prior art. I know what other people have done, but then I don't really articulate that enough, or I haven't in the past. So now I find that I find it really useful to thread between a high-level conjecture, which Susan leaves us with, that I think would be very useful for a second somebody to take and say, let's think about other disciplinary practices from professionals. Let's say I want to introduce urban planning into the classroom. How would I could actually apply that, but I then might think very concretely, what are the pieces that I need to embody here? What are the elements of the practice that I need to bring over? And I think that's a really helpful, it's helpful to work across these different levels of abstraction.
So Bill, can I respond? Do I have time? I don't think we did not begin with conjectures, and we did not do conjecture mapping that in the way that Bill Sandoval talks about it. What we did do, and I think this is really what our design-based research was about, was that we began deeply with a lot of ethnographic fieldwork. So we were in workplaces trying to understand what was their social organization, and what was really important to us was figuring out what was consequential for the people in the workplaces that helped them do their work, that helped junior people in the workplaces become more successful and learn new kinds of things, take on different dispositions at work. And then we were in classrooms trying to understand the same things. We were trying to understand what could be consequential in the classroom for these young people to think about themselves as, architects or biologists or cartographers. And from there, we then decided, based on our ethnographic fieldwork, what kinds of participant structures, what kinds of forms of talk, what kinds of representational practices could we bring into the classroom to do that. So I wouldn't say that we began with conjectures, we began with ethnographic insights. And I do think that that seems different than saying we began with conjectures about what we're going to say, but maybe not. I don't want to lose the fact that we began with like a deep ethnography and understanding of what the people were doing and what mattered to them. So maybe that's just a longer way of saying we had conjectures built from our ethnography.
Yeah, I think that's really neat to point out those different ways you can start. Because one of the things that Bill and I talked about a lot in our course was you usually start with some high-level goal or understanding. So Bill's talking about goals, like in Enyedi's paper, it's this understanding of what culturally responsive pedagogy is. But then there's usually something in design research that needs to be filled out. And to do that, you had to probably have some conjectures about like how to fill it out. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you take those ethnographic insights and translate them into practice with young people? And then those become the things that you test and refine throughout your work. But it's interesting to think about, like, well, what is that starting thing that we're trying to fill out? And then how do we start to fill it out and then look at what worked, what didn't? And I find the design principles, that final discussion of the paper, to be a very, very challenging part of a design research study. And I've definitely gotten challenged on it by reviewers before. Like, how do you have the evidence to say that other people should do this thing? And that's something I'm still definitely working on.
Well, I will say that, we had the benefit of that research was done in 1996 and 1997. We wrote the paper in 2008. I mean, that was many, many years later, after having lots of different kinds of opportunities to try these things for real in other settings. So I did research in science classrooms where I worked with teachers where we did similar kinds of poster sessions. I was a faculty member at CU Boulder where I organized poster sessions in very much the same ways that the design reviews were organized in this article. So we do that with our qualitative doctoral students. And so we have been thinking about this stuff for quite some time, and only after so many years did I feel like we could come up with grounded theoretical principles. I don't think that people can come up with really good, solid, working design principles from doing 1 year of design-based research or one cycle, but by that time we'd done quite a lot. So I feel grounded in that. I feel like it's justified to do that work.
Susan, we have a question from a participant outside, the 5 of us, and it's from Seth Jones, and he's wondering Susan, is it fair to say that someone could take your paper and build conjectures around some other professional practice without doing the ethnographic work themselves?
You could do whatever you want, is what I would say, but I do think that I think that it's true to the kind of research that we did and where this comes from and the principles that are really most important to us, that you should do the ethnographic fieldwork on the professional practices in order to understand what is really happening in professional or disciplinary disciplines with outside of what you're learning from the literature and research on it. I don't think we ever could have come up with what we came up with in terms of our design reviews and the kinds of questions we asked if we hadn't seen those people in action and learned from them what they thought was important about their own training and work practices. So I think you can do it, but I think it becomes richer when you do the ethnography. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to borrow a quote for the next part of the discussion, and we'll start off with Eve and Bill's reaction to this quote, and we can also post it in Etherpad. It's from the Aniti paper. It said, similar to the design of activities themselves, we developed our conjectures about learning over several iterations during our analysis. At first, they were driven by our theoretically based assumptions about how students were supposed to learn. In later phases of our analyses, our conjectures were refined based on the insights that emerged from preliminary analyses and the contingencies that shaped how the design unfolded. So we want to know, have you talk about, when you think about DBR in the context of your own work, what are your reactions to the quote, and how do you feel like it describes or doesn't describe the process and inherent struggles in the work?
Okay, so I would start by saying I think it's accurate for describing like this process of filling in. I was starting to talk about earlier that you never start with the full picture, and you sort of, it's like this process of figuring out how you're going to fill it in and complicate it as best you can. And for me, I think that there's two pieces of the work that the quote doesn't fully cover. So one is the way that the conjectures, and this is what I was getting at when I asked Susan this question, kind of shift during the work of actually doing the, whatever you want to call it, not intervention, but, you know, being in the setting, doing what you're trying to do, especially if you're a person who's deeply there while it's going on, that your conjectures shift. And I think that's a big challenge, is how do you keep track of how your conjectures are shifting while you're there doing the work? And second, that it's often also like what you think of as important questions and strands of analysis that shift. So not just your conjectures about your big idea, how learning occurs, but even like what you think is interesting to study in that setting can often shift as you're there and doing the analysis, and that's another challenge I definitely struggle to deal with and to follow.
Yeah, for me, I would add in this dimension of working in a participatory design way with teachers in school districts, some of what shifts during the work is not just your conjectures, but what's possible to do. That can include constraints like technology that's available and how it's working. So for example, in a project focused on classroom assessment, we had some really cool technology that has a lot of the affordances of Google Docs today, but when Google Docs didn't exist. And the reliability of the network made it not viable as a solution for us to test. So fortunately, we had anticipated a little bit of this ahead of time. But part of the adjustment that happened is not even theoretically based, but grounded in, well, here's a whole part of our project that we now have to shift away from and move towards a different kind of technology to support. In our case, we're trying to do classroom assessment. And it was disappointing because it was much more limiting kinds of technology that did not afford kinds of things that something like docs do. So I think part of the thing to underscore is while you're doing the work, things can shift, and it's not just driven by theory, but also the contingencies of practice and changing environments.
I was going to respond and say that I guess, you know, the conjectures I have that come from the ethnography comes from like a deep commitment to ethnography as a method. But why ethnography? Ethnography because I think it's really important to understand the social world and the organization of the social world. So Howard Becker's work is really important to how I think about the way people get to do things, right? And it's not about, he would avoid talking about sort of deep or high level theory, but that is a theory. I mean, in some sense, that social organization matters, right? The stuff you have around you matters. Who's with you and what you're working on, that all matters. So that kind of, when you have that kind of sort of very open-ended theory, it allows you to then, you know, recognize that these contingencies, that's actually part of my theory, right? I mean, it's part of the way I understand the world. So, you know, things fall apart or whatever, I have a way of understanding that, and then that leads me to, you know, if in my new project, it's like, okay, this new thing that has happened suggests that there are, you know, oppressive structures in the city and they're historically based. So now I can go and look at that stuff, go read about history and go read about racism in the city or whatever it might be. But it's not that it took me away from my fundamental theory about how the social world is organized and can be organized differently. Does that make sense to you, Bill? About like, that's how I would see what you're talking about. It's like when contingencies come up, you have to manage them. And so if you have a good theory, it'll help you make sense of it.
I agree. I think that's a layer of theory that's often missing in design-based research, which is what is the socio-historical, the institutional context that is going to shape your design and co-constitute it. It's, you know, we don't plop our designs into the middle of nowhere. We plop them into the middle of things. Right. And so we have to understand the middle of things a bit. What are the layered infrastructures that already exist? How are they aligned with, misaligned with one another and what we want to accomplish? Right. And what are some unintended effects of introducing designs? Because our designs, and this is, I think, a theoretical notion, our designs introduce new contradictions and dilemmas for people when we introduce them to systems. So really having a theory that helps us, I agree with you, Susan. It's like our theory actually has to help us anticipate the ways that designs and contexts co-constitute one another.
Yeah, so when I think about it, it's like you do have, and when I think about my own articles, there are like two kinds of theories every time, right? So there is the foundational theory that hasn't actually changed dramatically since I began doing this kind of work, but then the specific things that I bring in, the specific new theories, change almost every single time as I make sense of whatever it is that I might be doing. So that's helpful. Thanks, Phil.
Great, thank you. We're wondering if you will talk about sort of the key decisions across the life of a project. Like, what decisions do you need to make beforehand, during these iterations, and then in the analyses? Sort of a big question, so you might each pick a section of that for the next few minutes. But how do you think about the key decisions during a DBR project?
Yeah. Okay, so I made a little like sacrificial list, and I can start by throwing that out there, and then other people can add to that or complicate it. And I was just sort of musing about this question. So like, who are you going to work with? And I've been reading a lot of design research papers and thinking about like, how do you make that decision? A lot of them are convenient samples, right? Like who we can get to work with us, because it ends up taking a lot of time and energy to do this work. But certain people have much more principled ways of doing that, and I know Bill can talk about that. We talked about that in our class. So focusing on like how you are going to fill in these high-level theories with your specific design. I know when Bill and I taught the class, this was something that our students really, we talked a lot about, and they often struggled. So like, how do these big theories you have, like culturally relevant pedagogy or a commitment to enacting the practices that scientists enact, how do you actually fill those in a design? And then a big one for me is how you stay on top of data as you're collecting it. So how you make sense of what's going on as you are in there doing the work. And my dissertation was a 3-year redesign with a teacher, and I was in there 2 afternoons a week for most of the school year, the entire school year, and I got much, much better by my 3rd year at keeping track of the relationship of what was going on to what I was interested in and what I thought should be going on. And anyone starting in this work, I would definitely advocate getting yourself a system to do this and starting to do that work of like some sort of writing and data analysis and organization as you're going on. And how you stay focused on the conjectures that you started with or the commitments you started with when everything around you is up in the air and at play, and like you're spending a lot of your time, in my case, trying to make plants grow because they won't grow without you, or trying to mow and protect the areas that you need for your study. There's a lot. So how do you keep focused on your big questions as you're doing all the work you need to keep this huge thing going? And then finally, I think this other step of like, well, what do you actually focus on in your analysis once you've gotten all this data collected is a huge one. I like the papers we read today because I think they look at really different ways to go about doing that. So it's a nice, interesting one to focus on more. That's what I'll start with.
I'll add a couple and then let Susan speak. So all of the above seem important in the work. I think in terms of who you'll work with when you're thinking about when you've got practice partners, you know, what is their position in the community that you're working in? What in relation? How are they? What is their relation to others that they either work collaboratively with or are in a power relationship to? So I frequently partner with district leaders, and a constant tension is how to bring teachers' voices into that and structure the design that accounts for historical relations in which that are continuing, in which teachers are positioned relative to school district administrators as having less authority over the curriculum, for example. And then there's a layer of students in there so that we don't work with at all. So how do I maintain and bring in their voices into the design process? So really thinking and mapping about the historical relations of power and authority that exist in the systems that you're going into seems to be a lot of important upfront work that you then have to continue to do. So that would be one thing I would add.
So I like both of those, you know, both of your lists of things, and it really resonates with me that picking your partner, and I have been doing something in a different way than I did, for example, on the Math at Work project. I spend a lot more time in the field being really careful about who are the people? Who are they? What do they care about? And what do I care about? Because I've also spent a lot of time thinking about, why am I doing this work? You know, what kinds of outcomes do I want? What do I value in doing? Just, you know, forget design first, but just what do I want to see my world, our world, look like? And are these people I could work with? Like, do they care about the same kinds of things I care about? So if I'm talking about equity and agency, or do my partners care about those things? Because if I'm going to do work with them and they don't care about those things, I'm not going to bring any, I'm going to get out of there because I don't want to do research. I don't want to write about this stuff that is reproducing, you know, structures that I don't like, that I don't think are good for learning. So I think that really getting into your own, you know, understanding your own values and understanding the group, their values, is really important. I think that it's also essential for me that I have a collaborative team. So it's not ever just me. It is always going to be people, and I think this is, again, important to choose people who are your partners, so your graduate students or your other faculty members who share your commitments and who share your work, you know, your work ethic too, because we're talking about doing an enormous amount of field work and analysis, and it's ongoing, and it's exhausting, and you have to write. you know? So it's a lot of things that if you're going to do this work right, everybody needs to be on top of that all the time. And I think that you have to, as a, you know, the PI of a project that where there's design-based research, you have to help people understand how they can get articles written and how you as a team are going to really get your work out of your office or your lab and into the world, because without it, I don't think you're able to really understand what the impact of your design interventions were and what you're learning. I mean, I think it's important to do that, you know, content logging and thinking and memoing, but actually going to conferences and talking about what you're doing with other people is part of making real sense of the ideas that you're grappling with in the field.
Thank you so much. We have a question from our online participants, and then I'm going to pass it over to Sinem for the last part of the discussion. But Anna is wondering, a question left over from last week's DBR conversation. She asks, in building on practices, participation, and design work that's already starting within a context, how does that align with DBR interests in ontological innovations? We can ask her for clarification if needed, but I think she's asking about how do you work with things that are already happening in settings that you're partnering in?
I can speak a little bit to this, and maybe even Susan can add too. I think a lot of what we're doing, learning scientists are bricoleurs purposefully. We pull things together, we try to bring things together and build within the existing infrastructure, even as we're trying to move it. And I think that is the nature of the work itself, is to actually attend, at least as I theorize the work, is we are trying to engage with the infrastructure that exists. And so some of those pieces are not productive starting points because they either have goals that contradict our goals and values, or they are inhibiting of agency. So I think it's partly looking for the places that we can build on, that we in the environment that's we're working on, and trying to support those as one just broad strategy. It's hard to say, like without a concrete example, how you do it in the particulars, but you know, I think that's a principle that I would say apply to a range of situations.
Yeah, and looking, you know, thinking about like, well, what are the things that you can see? What are the ontological innovations? Like, there's always new tensions, contradictions, relationships, kind of forms of learning or participation that even if I'm working with something that's ongoing, as I start to design with it and with people and really start to see what's happening, there's just, I don't know, I've always found there's something new to see and to try to explain when you're doing this work, I guess because of its complexity. So for me, no, I think that's ongoing.
I'm not sure I understand what the question was, even though I heard your answers. I'm trying to understand what the question was. Katie or Daniela, do you feel like you have a better sense from the actual question?
No, I don't.
I think we'll move on, but if Anna adds to it, then we can go from there. Sinem, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Sounds good. This actually came up in your conversation today, you know, this notion of change when we do DBR. You know, Susan mentioned contingencies come up and you have to manage them. You know, Bill mentioned conjecture change over time. One of the things when I think about DBR is failure, or being comfortable with failure, is an important part of DBR. Because you might have ideas that you bring into the context, but the context is complex and your ideas change. And this is very scary feeling for a junior scholar. And traditionally we've been trained to sort of go with hypotheses and do studies or experiments that we know is going to confirm our hypotheses. Right? So it's not going to join necessarily more questions, but it answers a couple of questions, and you know we should be content with that. So my questions to Eve first, but I would like to hear everyone's ideas or thoughts. How do you balance successes and failures in your research? How do you turn moments of failure into opportunities for learning? And how do you decide what failures to write about and how to productively communicate them in your papers? So do you want to start?
I prepared on this one. So I guess the first thing I'd say is like what's so exciting about a design study and why I do them is because I don't expect my ideas to be confirmed, and I know I don't know enough about the thing itself yet. So it's like this filling in process that I was talking about, which inevitably is going to involve failure because I can't like expect all the contingencies and design for them. Maybe in a perfect world I get better, like so I can do more and more each iteration, but I'm just never going to be able to perfectly anticipate what will happen. I think the Enyades paper talks specifically about how, like, with design-based research, the intent isn't usually to just evaluate or perfect a curriculum, but like understand he says the complex mechanisms by which the big ideas we have get enacted. So I've kind of mapped out 3 forms of failure that I think I learned from in different ways and deal with differently in my writing, and I'll go from like the least scary to the most scary. So one is the ones that you recognize like early in the work, like while you're still in there doing the iteration, and that you can like iterate on and deal with as things are going on. So you get in a classroom where you start working with a group of teachers and something just isn't working, isn't gelling, and you can sort of start to untangle why, and in the moment try out some new possibilities. So that's where I find that process of actually writing and reflecting as you're doing the work is really important, because that becomes something that you can write about in papers as long as you were actually on top of it enough to both identify it and follow how you responded to it. So like I think Paul Cobb's papers give really good examples of doing this kind of like iterating in the moment and talking about what he'll often talk about, sort of unforeseen difficulties that students had in his work. So that's one. Others are ones like you recognize later, or like you just don't have the freedom to iterate in that way. So like the kind of example Bill's giving where like the infrastructure or the tools of that system just like can't help you meet whatever that challenge is. And then, you know, thinking about like, well, what do you learn from that failure that you could write about? I think there are some nice examples of people, like Enyades' paper, I'd say, is an example of this. Like he really uses the failure in where kids didn't get quite as far in terms of their statistical reasoning as he had thought they would to reason about these tensions that were at play between culturally relevant goals and as well as mathematical goals that he had. Melissa Grisalfi has just published a really nice paper in ZDM in which she follows the changes that she made across 2 different iterations of the Quest Atlantis program. And so she really looks at like, well, what didn't happen in the first time? How did I redesign in a principled way? And what did I learn? And that makes a really strong paper. The fact that she can talk about the difference in these 2 infrastructures that the program had and relate the failures in the first to successes in the second. Or thinking about Lima Berland has a set of nice papers that I'd advocate for people to read in which teachers didn't promote argumentation in ways that her curriculum design initially suspected they would. And she's written 3 really nice papers in which she looks at the difference in how the same curriculum was applied and used by 2 different teachers. Then she goes, in another paper, she tries to explain, well, why did that get implemented differently in those 2 classrooms? How does that relate to the differences in existing practices in those 2 classrooms? And then a third paper in which she looks at like a particular theoretical lens, actually the idea of Goffman's idea of framing, as a way to explain those differences. And I would say that came out of something that did not happen as well as she wanted it to. So those are, I thought of as some really nice examples. The third, where like the whole thing ends in chaos, and you just have no idea what happened or how you'd productively explained it. I've had like a few little cases like that within my work, and just using it to improve the next iteration. But those I think are more challenging, and I've found fewer papers about. I don't know if other people know of great examples of like everything failed and how do I make sense of this? That's a harder paper to write, I think. And that's the one that I find most scary.
It's hard to write that paper sympathetically and empathically, and also I'd say the implementation papers. I mean, for me, a big challenge in this work is in failure is to actually see your failure, but actually take the implementer's point of view on the situation. And to really get outside your designerly position and say, I'm going to look at how this person made sense of what was in play here from their point of view. And to me, our biggest failure in design research is actually how rarely we do that. We look at our great designs and say, oh my goodness, these people made a mess of them, and aren't very humble about that in the process of trying to come to understand, oh, it didn't work out like I intended, but I wasn't actually the one having to do this and pull this off. So to me, one of the ways that we can fail that's not okay, I think, in design research is to stop taking the designer's point of view for a moment and actually really look at the situation from the participants' point of view. What were they up to? What were their goals? What were they trying to do? How did what we introduced as part of the design work, and we might have been the implementers too, how did it actually create new dilemmas for people? So to me, that's one of the biggest challenges because we will fail, right? It won't work as we expected. And so how do we actually really look at that, honestly?
That's great. Susan, do you want to add anything before I ask follow-up questions?
I guess I was thinking about what both Bill and Eve were saying, and it seems like there need to be different genres of what you write, like how you write about design-based research. And I think of it that way. I think that there's like the design-based research paper I'm going to write. Then there's the ethnographic paper that I'm going to write, which is more like what Bill was just saying, like what happened here? How do I understand how this thing that I dropped in, destroyed or got taken up in this organization? But it's not about the design part. And then maybe there is a part that is more methodological, like I'm reflecting on the things that I did, and it's not again about the design, but it's really about like theorizing the method. And I think that we need to think about all those different ways of writing about design-based research, but at the same time I want to say that it is scary for people who are junior, as you said, because junior people don't have tenure. They're not secure yet in their social organization to feel that they can start talking about the things that completely failed. So no, I wouldn't recommend doing that right away. I would say that you should do tell some of your successes, talk about those things and talk about the work that went into them, and maybe hold off on writing about the things that completely blew up in your face, because we need to be strategic about how we build your reputations, because people are developing in these design-based research projects as well. And we need to be humble, but we also need to be kind of protective of people developing in our field.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as, a junior person who's been involved in these things, like there will be a moment in the middle of the implementation where you actually feel like the whole thing was a total failure. Like just because you can be so fixed on like your ideas and your goals and how in your head it was gonna go, that you just like, I've had so many moments where I was like, oh my gosh, I won't have learned a thing and be able to write anything. And then like there always is something to learn. And so far for me, there's been a genre that I can use to write about it. So like Susan, your paper is a nice example. I'm sure there were many, many things in that whole design that you didn't feel good about. But figuring out like this one thing that seemed really powerful and interesting to explore further, like I think there's just usually something like that.
There were like 6 months of things that didn't go well. I mean, but what I take from that, and I keep harping on ethnography, but for me, Fred Erickson is really an important touchstone for me. All his work is really helpful because I don't think of these as failures. I think of these as moments where people, like the designers and the people all involved, had to improvise, right? And Bill, you were speaking about this too. So you got to figure it out. You're gonna like make this thing happen in some way, right? We don't know exactly what way. And then later, when you feel like you're stuck and you don't know what you're gonna write about, that's the opportunity for you to figure out, well, what was cool about what happened? And I do need to step outside of my own field. I need to look to other fields. Like, what would somebody else care about? And I do think that, reading Latour, for example, reading Howard Becker, reading outside of what you may think is your particular field will help you to see the activity. It'll make the familiar strange. It'll make all the things that were happening in your classroom that were like exploding on you. It'll make it interesting from a different perspective, maybe historically or sociologically.
Can I just underscore that point and connect it to your earlier point about you did this analysis in 2006, 2007, and that's several years afterwards. And I think one of the powerful things about design research is you can go back to your data multiple times. Part of retrospective analysis is to go back again and again and look at a different piece and, as you're saying, bring a different theoretical lens that may actually not have been salient to you at the beginning, may have not had much currency, you've sort of discovered it, and that's a really powerful tool and a resource that you can bring to the table in design research. Absolutely.
That's great. Let me see if we have any questions before I ask another one. I don't think we do about this. One follow-up question I have, just because I'm curious of your observations and your experiences. Do you feel like there is a difference between design-based research projects that focus on developing technology versus developing a curriculum? Technology is part of, but it's about the curriculum itself. Do you see in the write-up or the way it's been conducted, do you see any differences or similarities? And let me explain, just open a parenthesis about why I'm asking this question. When I review for journals in educational technology, when people say that they're doing design-based research, sometimes I feel like they're just doing user testing. When the focus is on the product, improving the product, but they claim that they do design-based research. So it's but just naive observation, but I would like to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
I can jump in a little bit, having worked on both kinds of design research projects. For me, the most powerful technology projects are ones that really push the boundaries of what's possible for supporting learning, and they're very much informed by a notion of, let's see what happens if we do this in terms of making possible, for example, more, I'm thinking of the SimCalc project, more advanced mathematics accessible to middle schoolers, to a wider range of young people, students who otherwise might not get access to big ideas in calculus, for example. So expanding what's possible. I think of Jim Slata and his colleagues' work in really trying to create ambient room technologies to explore learning. What makes those different from very traditional user testing studies is that they are very much informed by trying to engineer something that's possible for learning, to make difference and to explore the ways that technology affords certain kinds of learning. Curriculum is in some ways extremely challenging for design research because of the unit of time that's involved. You know, in technology, you might have multiple uses of technology that you get to iterate on fairly quickly. With curriculum, a topic may come up once a year, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. It gives you time to really do some retrospective analysis in between. But it's also like, what is really helping support the learning here? It's quite a complicated story to be able to tell that in a design research fashion with curriculum.
Right. Thank you. Katie? Or Eve, would you like to add something?
No, I was just curious about your thoughts. I think you're the technology person here. Like, how have you balanced that in your work?
It is very challenging. So I've been developing games for families to support collaborative learning experiences. And I have done design experiments where, you know, some of my design experiments, I just literally had to use them as user testing because it's like you said, Bill, it wasn't accomplishing a learning goal. The changes that I had to make on the fly at that moment, you know, was so many that it wasn't sort of fruitful. That data wasn't fruitful because the conversations were disrupted by technology, and it was really about improving that game experience, if you will. So there's been times where, as I did implementation, I had to choose, okay, is there something that is important about learning, understanding collaborative learning experiences in a dyadic, you know, computer-mediated situation or not? Or is it just improving the game because it is about just having this, quote, smooth user experience? So that has been, in my experience, I have not always all my failures were productive, if you will. So.
We have about 5 more minutes. Susan and Bill and Eve, do you have any more questions for each other for the last 4 to 5 minutes?
I have a question. I mean, it builds off of what we were just talking about, but it's not about technology, but it's about learning, but it is about dispositions and identity. And so, like, how, if you care about that, which I care about, many people do care about this, how do you design for people to become, Chris Gutierrez talks about people becoming historical agents, right? Or taking on new kinds of identities in relation to the practices in which they're involved. So I think that is equally hard to talk about, and it's very complicated, and I think we need to get better about that. So because our theories of learning, like what many of us talk about as learning as becoming, we just had ICLS focus on learning as becoming. Well, what does that mean for design-based researchers? How do you really study becoming, and what are you going to count as becoming? How are you going to do that in a short period of time? And I think we need to grapple with that. And I think we might have to see some articles that don't do it exactly right first, or just like trying some things out. But I would love to see us take that seriously as well. And I think it's related to what you're saying. It reminded me of what you were talking about, that we're just going to have, sometimes we're going to have to mess around with the genre. Like, we're going to have to figure out how to talk about these things. Because I think that all the failures you had with the technology, well, that's really important for you to talk about. Maybe you're, think about what theories you're using to help you understand all those failures. And it's not necessarily about the technology in itself, but it is about the social world that allows that technology to thrive and succeed. I do think that the Enity paper is I really love that paper, and I think it does a very good job of kind of flipping itself over and analyzing what it did kind of wrong in order to come up with some really important theoretical insights. So thanks.
Yeah, I can add one thing to that, because I think we often talk about design research as really messy, but also realizing that anytime we do design research, by intervening and by our analysis, we're constraining like what people are doing and what we are able to look at. A thing that I constantly am working to get better at is like thinking about how I can not, and what I need to not constrain, and to be able to let happen and see, because there's, you just can't see that kind of stuff unless people can do stuff that's, like quote unquote off script. And there's many ways that we constrain who people can be, what aspects we look at. So I remember, right, in one of Roger's, when I took a class with him at Vanderbilt, he was saying just the difference between only recording kids during the lessons versus also recording the interstitial spaces, like after the lesson, when you're talking about maybe something really what you were doing, and maybe something totally different, or like maybe how much they hate it. And we don't hear that stuff unless we make choices about like when we look at things, widen when we look at things. I think that's absolutely important.
Yeah. And I think designing for identity and dispositions, we've got to foreground agency of the people in the situation as a goal, and also have a theory of design that is not all about ahead of time. So I've been reading Tim Ingold of late in his book on making, and that when we design, if our theory of design is that we've got to have it all mapped out ahead of time, that's not leaving room for identity and becoming. When we take a theory of learning as apprenticeship to fixed disciplinary practices, we're not leaving in room for identity. So our theories really have to do work for us in leaving room for identity and development of disposition, both in design and what our disciplinary aims are.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. As we wrap up, I'm going to remind people that next Wednesday we'll be continuing the conversation with Eve and Bill Penuel and Bill Sandoval about conjecture maps and stories from the field, and how that's been going in his recent work. So
and there's also a pre-reading for next week as well. So We know that finals are ending, everyone. And it's his piece on conjecture mapping, an approach to systematic educational design research. This 2014 piece in the Journal of the Learning Sciences, which we will make available on the website as well. So if you have time, read that, and that will inform our discussion for next week. And the session is at 3:30 Mountain Time on Wednesday.
And if you have additional questions from today, you can put them on Twitter, and we'll go up there and see if we can respond. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.